Back after the first session. My name is Simon Curley. I'm head of Terrestrial Ecosystems at Natural Environment Research Council. So I'm one of the people sort of responsible for developing the programs that we're going to be hopefully spinning out of this activity and some of the general strategic programs that NERC delivers. And this area is one of the things that's in my space. Okay, so I think we had a really excellent start this morning. We had some really good scene setting both on the science, on policy and on the environmental modelling. What we'd like to do now in this sort of second session is kind of put some nuancing on that and add some complexity to landscape decision making by building in the sort of the landscape domains of the stakeholder perspectives. So we've now got a series of 3 talks from sort of practitioners of the art, if you want to call it the art at the moment anyway, about how they go about making those decisions on what they need. So we'll start off with Chris Bolton from Natural England, a practitioner who's going to talk about managing landscapes change using metric, descriptive and experimental data. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good. Yeah, I'm a principal specialist for landscape in Natural England. And Natural England, as you're probably all aware, is the agency therefore responsible for landscape. We have a statutory remit for the conservation and enhancement of all England's landscapes within England. I'll give you the English perspective in my talk. And that includes designated landscapes and all other landscapes as well across England. And our work supports the DEFRA 25-year plan, A Green Future. We have our own strategy, Conservation 21, which supports the wider strategy, of course. And some of the key aspects of that are to create resilient landscapes and seas and putting people at the heart of the natural environment and growing natural capital. And with regards to the 25-year plan, as a landscape specialist with a landscape background, I'm very pleased to see that enhanced beauty is in there. And we'll need to discuss what we mean by enhanced beauty, hopefully wider than just designated landscapes, wider than enhanced natural beauty. But it's also alongside our aims to create nature recovery areas and networks. Putting the two alongside each other is returning to a more holistic, integrated way of thinking, which perhaps hasn't been there for some decades. We also have the Glover Review happening now of designated landscapes, so there's an opportunity, of course, within that, the sphere of designated landscapes, to improve things. My talk will cover going back to basics. We've had a taster of the modelling and scenarios that we can use, but I'd just like to go back to basics around what is landscape as context for upcoming discussions. Talk a bit about our work in monitoring landscape change, those smaller initiatives perhaps that Ian referred to that are a jigsaw of insights into how landscapes are changing that we need to use together. And also, I do have to go into the social science ground and talk a bit about people, because they are so important, their perceptions about change happening on the ground. Sorry, I regret doing that now. But you'll remember this slide all the more, perhaps for encapsulating landscape as a holistic concept, bringing the natural and the cultural together, people and place. And then towards the centre of the diagram, all those natural factors and cultural factors that contribute to landscape, and the experiential ones. I think they're mostly around the bottom, you know, as to how people experience the landscape. So let's bear that in mind in our discussions, that holistic approach to landscape. And then within our work in Natural England, we do use the tool of landscape character assessment. Landscapes aren't there to be preserved in aspic, they're changing, and previous talks have mentioned, you know, the pressures that are on them. So our landscapes that people are familiar with are inevitably going to change, and we have to bring people along with us in terms of how we manage landscape change. And landscape character is built up of all these stacks, these layers, underpinned by geology and soils I'm sure you're all aware of that. And then to the right here, I've shown you a map of how we've characterised the whole of England in an objective, systematic way to identify these 159 national character areas, showing how landscapes are different from one another, not necessarily one better or worse than another. And that is a spatial framework that we're beginning to use quite consistently in our work, and a spatial framework that has been readily welcomed by external partners as well. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. A definition of landscape. The one that I would flag up is a widely accepted definition that is accommodated by the European Landscape Convention. The UK signed up to that in 2006. Since then, it's had a bit of a varied ride, as it were, in terms of its acknowledgement by government, but we are party to that, and it's a Council of Europe initiative, a Council of Europe treaty, and signed up to across Europe and interest worldwide as well. It encapsulates the natural, rural, urban, peri-urban, inland waters, and the seas as well, out to 12 nautical miles. It's about outstanding as well as everyday landscapes. It encourages member states to identify their landscapes, involve local people in preparing local landscape objectives, and therefore we've done a lot of work, leading work around landscape characterization in this country. So I feel that there's still a role for the European Landscape Convention going forwards. Perhaps we can consider that as well in our discussions. But coming back to the national character areas, these overarching framework, one of the benefits of it is that it provides that big picture, but the idea is also that there's a hierarchy of nesting areas within it. So there are national character areas, there's geographical areas, and within that, many local authorities, designated landscapes, other organisations prepare landscape character assessments at a more local scale beneath that, identifying landscape types, and then within those types, smaller geographical areas. So you have that cascade from areas to types, areas and types, getting down to smaller detail. And in 2014, we finished publishing the National Character Area profiles for each of those 159 areas, a collaborative effort with many partners, providing that holistic big picture of the natural environment and social factors as well within these areas. And this is just one example, the fens. These are PDFs that you can get from .gov UK, and each one is a body of evidence, essentially. And you can tab through them to get descriptive material, facts and figures, an idea of how ecosystem services are being developed in each area, albeit sort of a nascent piece of work. We can build on that. And within them, each one, there are several statements of environmental opportunity, identifying the issues in the area which can bring partners together, funding together, collaborative projects. This is just one example around managed retreat in the fens. They're a starting point for discussions, local discussions on the ground. So perhaps this can provide a framework for moving forward for scenarios and modelling to exist within. And I mentioned that there are more localised landscape character assessments nesting beneath. On the left is the national character areas for the east of England, and then there's a more detailed landscape characterisation for the east of England and centre, and there's work on seascape characterisation as well, working with the MMO, so that there's that more or less seamless body of evidence available. But landscapes, yes, we know they're three-dimensional, but there's the fourth dimension, time, in terms of how they change, And in fact, there's a fifth dimension, the landscapes in people's minds, how they're perceiving change. Talking about change, I was involved in countryside quality counts, which to my mind was one of the first big initiatives sparked by the 2000 white paper, where government commissioned an indicator on landscape change across England. And to drastically summarise, the indicator for the period 1999 to 2003 looked like this in terms of the findings. It was a piece of work that involved a range of databases, analysing them into different themes, from field boundaries and woodlands right way through to settlement patterns, other themes as well, and providing this big picture on how England's landscapes were changing. Within that, there are the 159 NCAs, so they're coloured as to how the nature of the change happening, whether there was overall maintenance or enhancing of landscape character, or whether the landscape character was being neglected, or the features that made up character were being generally neglected, or whether the features that were associated with the character of an area, actually there were new features being introduced, therefore the character was diverging. And that, that of course is a very prevalent change that is occurring. And the overall stats were that 20% of our landscapes were being neglected, that weren't being managed appropriately, and 20% diverging. And you can see the spatial distribution of this big picture at that time, 2003. So we really need to be updating a piece of work like that. And that's something I'm involved with doing, because I think the data from that will help to inform the metrics for the 25-year plan as to how England's landscapes are changing. A bit more detail, I want to mention agri-environment as a key intervention that Natural England has been involved with, and that I've been involved with, and particularly environmental stewardship as an example. Of course, in recent years we're now moved into countryside stewardship. But this work was dated around 2012, 2013, and it set up a way for us to monitor the effectiveness of environmental stewardship in the enhancement, the maintenance enhancement of landscape character. And this was NCA based as well. The NCAs were divided into 6 agricultural landscape types, and that's the map at the top. And within this work, we much of it carried out with land use consultants, so it's working collaboratively with practices. Within each of those agricultural landscape types, we identified 18 pilot study areas of different landscape types, and then within those study areas there were nested survey sites, which is the map at the bottom. So we wanted to get good coverage of England in this pilot, and we wanted to get areas to be surveyed on the ground, looking at how different agri-environment options had been deployed in those landscapes. And we devised a rapid survey technique for field work, which was very important so that we could get essential information rapidly, cost effectively, using tablets, of course, for recording data. And then the data would be run through modelling procedures, here using the land cover map 2007 distribution of grasslands and overlaying the data from the field survey with that. The overall way of tackling this was to quantify the stock of features that were important for certain characteristics. And once we'd identified the total stock within an NCA for those characteristics, we'd quantify the total options that were appropriate to managing those features and the uptake of options. So through having information on uptake of options affecting key characteristic features, we were able to see whether the uptake met certain thresholds, thresholds at which the uptake of options would start to have a noticeable effect on the landscape. So hopefully that's sort of given a picture that Field survey validation is very important, on the ground, and also the use of indicators and thresholds comes into play here. And I'd perhaps like to see something of that sort in our discussions going forward as well. And then the big picture overall of change for each of those agricultural landscape types as to whether change was neutral, positive or strongly positive in each of those national character areas. And this is the overall picture for each of those agricultural landscape types. And we can see how uplands benefit from agri-environment, appropriate grazing regimes, and often the strongly positive coincides with designated landscapes which tended to be most heavily targeted in recent years. Perhaps that might change a bit going forward, but this sort of work informs policy in that way. The other thing that we're gradually getting into, it's early days in Natural England. My colleague Richard Alexander in particular, who's here, is exploring this ground, remote sensing, particularly with regard to habitat change. And this work uses the freely available satellite imagery from the Sentinel program. And I'm looking into, apart from habitat change in more localized areas, what the potential is for this, for detecting change in landscapes more broadly, affecting landscape character. And Richard's work here is focusing on the normalized difference vegetation index, which is the appropriate value here that Richard is focusing on to look at change in land management affected by cutting and burns. And the challenges, perhaps most importantly to mention really, are that actually identifying change is perhaps the easy bit, but you need to narrow it all down really to identify the specific changes that you're interested in because of all the noise that there can be. So there are models around the possible worlds, identifying the most plausible likely changes so that you can narrow down the possibilities, looking for anomalous change, identifying outliers from the norm, generally to eliminate noise such as, for example, seasonal variations in the vegetation. There are technical issues around pixel alignment and transformation errors in handling the data. From my point of view, I think this sort of work is invaluable, perhaps most suited to local change detection. The logistics perhaps are great in terms of looking more widely across England's landscapes, but it would be tremendous to be able to make progress in that area as well. And we could also use it to highlight change on the ground where we should go in and carry out more detailed field survey. Finally, another tool in the toolbox, as it were, and essential for us to make progress on, is to find out more about people and how they value their local landscapes. So we're tentatively making up ground on this, and one of the tools that we found useful is the participatory GIS tool, so to enable people for a particular project area to go and register online, call up the maps, aerial photographs and other information that they need about the landscapes they're familiar with or the landscapes they visit, and tell us what they think about them. And we've been testing this out with Arnside and Silverdale area of outstanding natural beauty. But equally this could be applied to other landscapes, urban landscapes, where there's multiple deprivation, not necessarily to these sorts of landscapes here. And they're able to tell us how they value the landscape in terms of the views that are important to them, where they gain a sense of beauty and tranquility, sites that are valuable for recreation, tranquility, where they get a sense of tranquility. Those are the colours up there, top right. And when they go online, they can also provide a bit of narrative about how they enjoy the landscape as well. So this is the sort of material that we get back. Virtual pins stuck in maps and a narrative about why people enjoy those landscapes. And also narrative relating to how the landscapes are changing. This is really valuable stuff, as it were, about what's in people's minds and their cultural values, the qualitative aspect that we need to match up with the quantitative data that we're perhaps in this room most interested in. But that enables us to make some of these less tangible values more tangible and start to map where people enjoy the landscape and why. And so here we have a map of the landscape types in the area overlaid with the data. ADAS were involved with this, working with ADAS in this particular case. And so that helps us get a sense of what sites were valuable, what reasons. We could underlay other information, land use information, or other proposals for landscape change, land use proposals. But at least it gets that data around cultural values in the mix, which hasn't really happened strongly enough in the past. And although rather simplistically shown here, you know, these areas can, hotspots for particular cultural values can be mapped. So I've sort of drastically summarised some of our work, just some of our work relating mainly to landscape and landscape character. And I want to sort of be able to champion landscape as a discipline, landscape as a concept that can work alongside natural capital thinking and applying the ecosystem approach. I think landscape can provide the big picture, but also nest down into more local scales. So it's not just about landscape scale, it's about how landscape provides a big picture, but we can drill down into more detail as well at more localized scales. I think there's scope for us to think in terms of an observatory, collaborative observatory on landscape change. Some of our work has flagged up the fact that over recent times there has been a loss of complexity in the features that make up our landscapes, that make one landscape different from another. They're becoming more similar, and that distinctive sense of place has been lost. Now that's a trend that is continuing, but in places it's being attenuated, turned around in some places. Designated landscapes are important for that. And that's often very subtle incremental change. At the same time, there are aspects of change such as energy landscapes, turbines, solar, urbanization, housing in the landscape, market towns with more expanding housing, creating sharper edges with the landscape, precision farming in places, mechanized farming continuing so that, you know, could be a sharp contrast between very strongly patterned landscapes and intensive landscapes with messier landscapes, adjoining messier landscapes, bits that are left over, or the bits that can be encouraged to be nature recovery networks. So that's just a hint at some of the overall trends that the work has been identifying. Yes, so an observatory, a way of bringing all this data together as an observatory on landscape change in England would be good. And lastly, really, to come back to the national character area profiles as an overall framework to think about that. So that's where I was going to finish. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Are there any questions? Time for perhaps one, maybe two questions. Yeah.
Thank you. I've been working with colleagues using the national character areas in some work on soils and livestock production systems, and they're extremely useful. I mean, I really do find them useful. The problem, of course, though, is that they stop at the Welsh border and the Scottish border, don't extend across to Northern Ireland. So, in conversation with your counterparts in the other parts of the UK, are there comparable systems or plans for comparable systems or for some sort of joint approach to extending this framework to UK scale?
Well, we haven't got quite to the stage where there'll be a seamless joining up. But we have got to the stage where we're talking about it, and in Wales, of course, there's their land map system, which is very well different, but has synergies. And so I think there's potential to join up there and to work on that. And there are sort of similar frameworks in Scotland as well. But we are talking about it. We have a joint group looking at landscape change across the British Isles, Southern Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So we're beginning to talk, and I think that's a good idea to put on the agenda and progress.
Last question, I think.
Yeah, really interesting talk. Thank you. I mean, I'm a physicist based at Exeter. I'm interested in climate dynamics, and I thought these natural characteristics, they're really interesting. And they give a very nice perspective of change. Just looking at the maps, there seems to be a latitudinal curve in there. Is there a physical reason for how the orientation of the regions and prevailing weather?
In the shape of the framework. Well, I think they're determined largely by geology and soils. And if you look at a geology map of the British Isles, you'll see that same pattern, which is reassuring. Yeah. So that's I would say that's the predominant influence in terms of the mapping, but they are a body of evidence around a whole range of interests, not just the underpinning geology.
Really useful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris.